One of the more common reasons for player churn or people leaving your game is when they run into a difficulty spike. Be it small, large, impossibly difficult, masochistically huge, it doesn't matter. And as a developer, you need to pay attention to where things may get difficult with your game and purposely try to avoid them. So for today's critical thought, we're going to be discussing the common difficulty curves or difficulty spikes that can occur in a game, and how do you keep your player base from just leaving in droves and your completion rates from plummeting down. Difficulty spikes are something that, for a lot of games, it really is unavoidable. Whenever you introduce a new concept, a new mechanic, new system, there's going to be that pushback or that period of unfamiliarity with it. And when that happens, it can raise the difficulty of your game up. If we look at kind of like a normal progression curve being kind of like this, spikes are when it goes up like that. And how high or how impactful a difficulty spike can be a surefire way to get players to quit your game. A lot of people, unless you're a masochist like somebody around here, don't like to bang their head against a wall for 20 minutes, an hour, or even 1 minute of their play experience. And the better that you can ease players into new situations or prepare them for it will oftentimes mean the difference between a high player retention or having those drop-offs that we see in our new show where I review achievements and completion rates in games. And as a developer, like I said, you're always going to have these spikes, but you want them to be minuscule. Again, if it's on a scale of 1 to 10, you want your difficulty spike to be maybe a 2 or 3, not a 15 or 25. And when we look at specific genres or specific types of games, there's very similar tells or situations that lead to spikes. So let's start with action games. So your Bloodborns, Dooms, Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, anything that is player skill focus. And it's actually very easy to make a difficulty spike in these kinds of games. And it really comes down to how you design your enemies. So for a lot of these games, as we've talked about on previous discussions, enemy design is usually built around tiers. Your tier 1 enemy is your common scrub, the guy you're going to fight the most often. While tier 3 or 4 could be a mini boss or some super advanced enemy, kind of like the Marauder from Doom Eternal. For common enemies, the player is oftentimes given free reign about how they're going to fight them. And what we see, I know especially from my own standpoint, is that if we get to a strategy that we like, it becomes our bread and butter. So that could be charge heavy attack for an instant kill, go for parries or reposes, quick combos, fire magic, archery, whatever that one strategy you're going to use more and more than anything else. So the difficulty spike occurs when the game just says, that strategy you've been using? You can't do it here. And we see this one of the more common examples, and we'll kind of take in we'll talk more about in the second part of this video, is when super armor gets introduced. If you're not aware of the term, super armor or hyper armor is what we commonly see in fighting games, and sometimes it's mentioned in action games, where a character can complete an attack or will not get stunned, flinched, or distracted when they're swinging their weapon. So that with most normal enemies, you can just run in, start punching them, shooting them, whatever, stagger them, they'll die. When the super armor comes in, you start doing that, the enemy's just going to look at you, raise up his axe, and just smack you down with it. And what can happen is that if you haven't properly prepared the player for when this gets introduced, or have multiple viable ways of getting around enemies, this can be a very annoying spike. It's been something that we've seen in a lot of action games. In Dark Souls 2, for instance, that in the first area, you're fighting a lot of common enemies, maybe 1 or 2 larger ones. And then you get into that coastal area, and then suddenly you're just fighting these giant suits of armor who will smack you off the ledge into your watery abyss. Now, another way that this can occur is if you introduce an enemy with a new mechanic or new rule that doesn't properly or doesn't really correspond to anything else the player has done. So, if let's say this game is entirely melee driven, then you introduce an enemy who can only be defeated by throwing barrels at them or doing something that the game has not really properly prepared you for. Going back to the Marauders of Doom Eternal, this is where a lot of people felt that it didn't really seem fair. That you can run around and shoot and glory kill and ice grenade and normal grenade and rip and tear to your heart's content. The Marauder basically says, you gotta fight me just like this or you're not getting past it. And to be fair, this is what we commonly see from boss and mini-boss class enemies, that to make them different or unique, they're going to operate at unique rules. The bosses from Souls-likes are really good examples. You're fighting all these normal enemies in Dark Souls 3, then Champion Gundyr shows up and roundhouse kicks you to the face. But you need to kind of wean the player onto this. That if every enemy in the game except for one hard fight cannot do X, and there's no real way that the player is prepared for that, it's going to feel like you pull the rug out from under them in terms of being able to fight these enemies. And what we commonly see, or what is considered kind of quote-unquote good design, is that new rules, new systems, new obstacles should be introduced in more of a controlled or safe environment. If you're going to have something that has never before seen before, some unique power, make the player fight it one-on-one or show it off in a cutscene. Such as, let's say you have an enemy that is a kamikaze. You could have a cutscene where the enemy, far away, runs into a common enemy, does his little, I'm going to explode animation, boom, explodes, and tells the player, hey, this guy's going to blow up if you get close to him, so don't get close to him. And then you're going to introduce it into more of a controlled fight, and then eventually what you want is for these elements to just be formally available, that it can happen at anywhere at any time. And we see this in the Souls-like games when all of a sudden the hyper or super armored enemies are going to be with normal enemies. And then the nightmare really begins, as fans of Souls-likes know. So the other example of this is what we see in RPG-based systems, when you have abstraction and numbers behind the scenes. And this can lead to sometimes unintentional difficulty spikes, and in some cases intentional difficulty spikes when the numbers are skewed against you. I think my camera is all acting funny there. Hopefully I'm not being all blurred right now. But for RPGs, raise your hand or type this in the comments if this has ever happened to you, where you're able to have all kinds of crazy buffs and debuffs and special abilities and things that can weaken or do crazy effects and works on the common enemies, and then the boss is completely immune to all of it. This has been a staple of many RPGs that have been released. And it even led to one of the topics we've talked about here when it came to false choices in games. But it's very rare, and one of the things I always test whenever I play a new RPG is, what do the buffs and debuffs do? Like, if a buff lets me go from I do 20 points of damage to I do 22 points of damage, yeah, that's not going to be worth a turn. But we have seen some RPGs that really have allowed players to, in a way, I guess, quote-unquote, one-up the design with proper status effects. And it's something you have to be careful of as a developer, because this can certainly mess with the balance of your game. So, for instance, in Shin Megami Tensei Persona 4, I beat that game by exploiting the accuracy debuff. And what I did was, by using it 3 times, which is like the max effect you can put onto an enemy, I made the boss so unable to hit anyone, that I could have a party member who was weak to their attacks, and they would never hit that boss. It was kind of hilarious. In Darkest Dungeon, the Man-at-Arms, I believe, had a buff that lets you raise the dodge chance on your entire party. And when we played the Crimson Court, the final boss of that just kept whiffing. And as anyone who's played Darkest Dungeon knows, misses and dodges are very big deals. But I believe that's been nerfed since I managed to do that strategy. But you need to be aware when you introduce elements in your game what their overall impact is going to be. You do not want kind of player choice spikes in your game. So what I mean by that is, let's say we're playing an RPG where I can choose, my class, weapon type, all that crazy stuff. And I choose to be fire spec. And fire works for a lot of the time, we're all good. And then we come to the 3-hour fire immune dungeon. And all of a sudden, all my powers, all my abilities, everything that I've worked, the last who knows how many hours for, it's worthless. It will not hurt or kill any enemy. And that can be a killer, or that will be a killer, for people wanting to play your game. Now, another aspect when it comes to RPG progression, as I said, are numbers. And what I mean by that is when the stat differences are so extreme that the player is not really able to compete unless they grind. So what I mean by that is, let's say we're in a dungeon and all the common enemies are levels 10 to 13. You get to the boss, and that boss is level 25. And if for those of you who watch me or have played Yakuza Like a Dragon, you know what section I just brought up there in another example. But you don't want things to be such a spike. Again, if the difficulty curve of your game is like this, you don't want the spike to be like that. And we see this a lot in mobile games, especially RPG-driven mobile games. I talked about this on the show when I was playing a Punishing Gray Raven, that it kind of went like this, like, we're doing this, and then we get to level 5-8, and the enemy is so powerful that I literally was doing 0 damage with my strongest attacks. But then the second I finish that level, the difficulty plummets. And this is what you don't want in your game. If you're going to have the difficulty increase, you don't want it to just be going up and then all the way back down. You kind of want it to be like going up, then maybe going a little bit back down, then going up, a little bit back down. You don't want to just be constantly escalating, because it's going to become very tiresome, and you're going to eventually churn out a lot of your player base if it just keeps going up and up and up into masochism mode. And spikes that have those sharp plummets are something that we commonly see in games where the developer wants you to either force to grind, force to spend money, and it can be a huge killer to player motivation, especially if the player is doing everything by the books. As in, if I am completing every major quest, I'm doing everything in my story chain, and then you introduce something like this, how was the player supposed to prepare for this? And I know someone's going to argue about having side quests or secondary quests, but again, the point of a side quest is it's supposed to be side. You don't want to balance your game under the assumption that the player is going to be doing every single main quest, side quest, secondary quest, bonus quests, and get to level, 60 in 2 hours of play. You want to, again, establish a baseline for your title and guide the player through it, so that when there is a spike or when something new or challenging is introduced, the player has all the tools in their kit to figure this out. So with that said, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about a recent example of a game that kind of went spiky and what this can mean, especially if it's shown in a demo. For entry-level students, we have 20 essential games to study, and then the Game Design Deep Dive series that takes an extensive look at different genres, with horror coming by the end of 2021. So the footage that you're seeing here is from Greek Memories of Azure. And this was one of the games we played during the DreamHack Beyond Spotlight. So the reason why I'm bringing the footage here is that this was the very definition of a Divly Spike for this game. And there's several important lessons to take note of while you watch this B-roll of me getting a curb stomp by this guy. So Grek is at least pitched at the beginning as more of a puzzle platformer, kind of like the Lost Vikings, that you're switching between the different characters. You can see the woman in the upper left there. And combat, for the most part, at least up until this fight, is very basic. None of the enemies had any kind of super armor, they can be stun locked, and you can really just dodge or just move around them to easily fight them. But all that changes when we get to this fight. Now, a few things to keep in mind. The footage that you're seeing is from the demo. I don't know where this specific fight occurs within the game itself. So if the game does feature upgrades or additional things you can unlock to make your character stronger, this fight may not be that bad. But for the demo, and again, this is a very important point about playtesting and UX, the demo is going to be what people will see and process your game about. And they find a fight like this in the demo, they're going to think that the rest of the game is like this. And that will mean that they will maybe not play the game if they found this to be frustrating. So this enemy, as he's moving around, you're noticing just how reactive or how active he is in terms of his movements. There's very little tells when he's about to swing his hammer or that mace of his. So you have to kind of know preemptively that after he does move X, that he's going to immediately counter with that mace. And again, there is no other fight up until this point in the demo that is anywhere like that. And you can see me trying to figure out those, maybe there's another way to fight this guy. Maybe he's not supposed to be this difficult. But no, that's not how this works for this battle here. But you can see that as I'm trying to fight this guy, I'm predominantly using the sword character because the lady, she doesn't have a forward dash. She has a backstep. When you can't really backstep to avoid something that's running right at you. Now, there's another point right there. I don't know if you saw that. But during this fight, he is moving so fast that even if I am properly dodging, I don't have the recovery frame or the recovery window to then dodge again. And it is this is a really great example of what a Divly Spike is. It is a situation that is not like anything else that has come before it. It came out of the blue, and most importantly, nothing of what I played, and I'm sure what you've played if you've played the demo, prepares you for this specific fight. Now, I don't know if this guy shows up as a common enemy later, or, if there's more to this in the finished game. But this is not how you want to end a demo, because this fight is such a uptick of what everything else came before it. And I'm pretty sure this left a very nasty taste in a lot of mouths of people who wanted to play this game and was enjoying it up until this point. Another very important aspect of a fight like this is that it does feel not like the rest of the game. As I said at the start of the section, most of what we played of Grek on stream was kind of puzzle first, platforming second, combat third. In this case, this is pretty much combat first, and for people who are looking at this game and thought it would be more puzzle-oriented or more platforming-based, this is a very rude awakening for them, and I think this will cost some fans. And it's something you need to be aware of if you are combining genre types. RPG shooter, platforming action, action adventure, and so on. That if one aspect of the design is pushed too far, you may alienate people who came to this game for the other genres or the other mechanics. And We did eventually beat this, and a more surprising twist, we beat this on the one run that I didn't expect to win on. But again, you have to realize that I play action games. Like, that's kind of like my first and foremost. So for me to, buckle down and get good at this, that's not normal, as fans of the streams and the channel here will testify. But for a lot of people, and what you have to understand, they don't like spikes. Most people probably don't like to play something or do something where it just keeps telling them, you failed, you have to keep doing this. Especially for their leisure time. And what happens is they're going to get frustrated, say, oh, I don't have to deal with this anymore, and they're going to quit, and they're not coming back. And this is where we get into that concept of churn. And when this happens and you lose people because of difficulty spikes or poor UI UX or whatever, guess what? They're not coming back to this game, and they're not going to come back to your next game or your game after that. And this is why UI UX is such a big deal. Because if you can't retain your player base, it doesn't matter how many copies of a game got sold, how many people played or reviewed it, you're going to be behind the 8 ball for your next title. And that's not what you want as a developer. So to begin to wrap things up for our video, difficulty spikes are for the most part unavoidable. Depending upon how your game is or what kind of design you have, you're going to run into something frustrating. It's just the nature of the beast. But how you properly prepare the player, how you train them, and even what options you give them during play can be enough to help them get through it. And you're going to see on this run that somehow through a miracle I actually beat this guy. But you shouldn't have to rely on dumb luck or cheesing or again breaking the game. Because if you do, people are going to feel like that's the only way you're going to progress, and they don't want that in their titles. So, with that said, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and let me know if there's any games that a particular spike just, sapped your willpower and interest in terms of playing it. As always, check out our Discord and Patreon link down below and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until our next piece, take care.